The rain fell like bullets on the planet Gork and Mork's fist, which the orcs appreciated. Snikgit did not. Each drop that struck his scrawny green hide felt like a tiny hammer, reminding him of his place at the very bottom of the clan's hierarchy. He scurried between the rusted shanties and looted vehicles, dragging a sack of squig droppings twice his size toward the boss's tent. A massive boot connected with Snikgit's ribs, sending him sprawling into the mud. The sack burst, covering him in its foul contents. Above him, Grimtooth the Knob laughed, showing teeth like broken bottles. The Knob bellowed about Snikgit being late with the fertilizer, how the boss wanted his lucky fungus growing proper. Snikgit wheezed, tasting blood and something worse. 23 years he'd survived in this camp. 23 years of kicks, bites, and near-death experiences. He'd learned early that running fast helped, but thinking faster helped more. The little grot apologized, blaming the rain for making everything slippery as he gathered the spilled droppings with his bare hands. Grimtooth raised his boot for another kick, then paused. His tiny brain was working on something, which for an orc was like watching a rusty gear try to turn in mud. The Knob remembered Snikgit was the grot who'd found his favorite shooter last week, under the scrap pile where he'd thrown it. Grimtooth lowered his boot, acknowledging that Snikgit had a good memory for a grot. He warned that if Snikgit was late again, he'd use the grot's skull as a hood ornament, then stomped away. As the Knob departed, Snikgit allowed himself a small smile. Memory. That was his edge. Orcs forgot things faster than they lost teeth in fights, but Snikgit remembered everything. Every superstition, every ritual, every stupid belief that governed their violent lives. He dragged the remains of his burden to the warboss's compound, where Scarface's massive tent squatted like a beast made of rust and leather. The guards, two orcs named Gutripper and Face Masher, were arguing about lucky numbers. Gutripper insisted 7 was luckiest, waving a chopper with exactly 7 notches. Face Masher countered that 3 was better, like the number of gods, holding up 3 fingers though he only had 2 on that hand. Snikgit slipped past them while they were distracted. Inside the tent, he found chaos. Warboss Scarface stood over a table covered in maps, surrounded by his lieutenants. The maps were upside down, but nobody seemed to notice or care. Scarface roared about crumping the humans tomorrow, claiming they were hiding in the valley like scared grots. Snikgit froze. He'd been in the supply tent earlier, fixing a leak in the roof. Through a hole in the canvas, he'd heard human voices on a captured Voxcaster. They weren't hiding in the valley. They were setting up an ambush in the rocks above it. The smart thing would be to stay quiet. Let the orcs walk into the trap. Maybe Scarface would die and a slightly less brutal warboss would take over. But as Snikgit watched the orcs plan their doom, a different thought crept into his cunning little mind. What if he warned them? Not directly, that would just get him killed for listening in on the boss. But what if he found another way? That night, he lay in the pile of rags and garbage that served as the grot's quarters, mind racing. By dawn, he had a plan. It was insane, likely to get him killed, but it was better than more beatings. He waited until the camp was stirring, then ran screaming through the mud toward Grimtooth's tent. The grot shrieked about having a vision, claiming Gork had spoken to him. Grimtooth emerged, already reaching for his slugger, demanding to know what the yelling was about. Snikgit, eyes wide and crazed, told of his dream. Gork had shown him metal beakies hiding in the rocks, ready to shoot down at the boys from above. Gork had told him to warn everyone. The Knob's hand paused on his weapon. Every orc knew Gork and Mork sometimes sent visions. Usually to weird boys, true, but the gods worked in mysterious ways. Grimtooth questioned whether Gork would really talk to a puny grot. Snikgit insisted he was small enough to hear the whispers, that Gork had said the boys should go around the rocks, not through the valley. He suggested testing it by sending grots to scout the rocks first. Grimtooth considered this. Grots were expendable, and if the runt was wrong, he'd have his fun later. He agreed, but promised to invent new ways to hurt Snikgit if he was lying. An hour later, the scouting grots came back riddled with lasgun burns, babbling about humans everywhere in the rocks. The camp erupted in amazement. The little grot had been right. Word spread faster than a fire in a Prometheum depot. By the time the warband prepared to move out, taking the long way around the ambush, half the camp had heard about Snikgit's vision. Warboss Scarface himself demanded to see the lucky grot. Snikgit found himself standing before a creature that could crush him like a bug. Scarface's one good eye studied him with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. The warboss asked if Snikgit was the grot who heard Gork. Snikgit confirmed it, explaining that Gork had made him small so he could fit in the spaces where the god whispered. Scarface laughed, calling it the stupidest thing he'd ever heard. But the grot had been right about the ambush. The warboss leaned down, breathing fungus beer fumes, and declared that Snikgit would come with them. If Gork talked again, he was to tell Scarface. If not, the warboss made a gesture across his throat. The battle was a slaughter, but not the kind the humans had planned. The orcs came from behind, catching the ambushers in their own trap. As Snikgit watched from relative safety behind a demolished truck, he saw his opportunity expanding. When they returned to camp, victorious and loaded with scavenged weapons, Snikgit was no longer just another grot. He was Snikgit Da Prophet, the grot who heard the gods. Some orcs were skeptical, but most were willing to believe. After all, he'd been right once. Now came the hard part, maintaining the lie. Snikgit threw himself into his new role with desperate enthusiasm. He studied every superstition, every ritual, every half-remembered piece of orc theology. He learned that Grimtooth always touched his lucky tooth before battle, that Scarface believed odd numbers were blessed by Mork, that the mech boy, Clankbash, thought machines had spirits that needed appeasing. He began making predictions, vague enough to be interpreted many ways. He proclaimed that Gork said tomorrow's battle would see much blood spilled, which was always true when orcs fought. He'd warn against fighting when the sun was highest on days when he'd overheard the boys complaining about the heat. But Snikgit's masterstroke came when he invented the ritual of the burning wheel. It started simple. He'd found an old tire in the scrap heap and had an idea. That evening, as the boys prepared for a raid on a nearby human outpost, Snikgit dragged the tire into the center of camp. Gutripper paused in sharpening his chopper to ask what the runt was doing. Snikgit announced loudly that Gork had shown him a new ritual. If they danced around the burning wheel while chanting his name, he'd make their weapons shoot straighter. He doused the tire in Prometheum and lit it. The rubber burned with thick black smoke that made the orc's eyes water. Snikgit began hopping around it, making up nonsense that sounded vaguely like orcish prayers. He chanted about Gork the mighty making their dagger the best, about Mork the cunning helping their bullets find human eyes. To his amazement, some of the boys joined in. First one, then three, then a dozen orcs were stomping around the burning tire, bellowing his made-up chant. The smoke made them dizzy, the rhythm made them excited, and by the time they went to battle, they were convinced their weapons had been blessed. Whether by coincidence or psychology, the raid was spectacularly successful. The orcs came back with more loot than they'd gathered in months. After that, the ritual of the burning wheel became mandatory before every significant battle. Snikgit's position solidified. He was given his own tent, a leaky, patched thing, but paradise compared to the grot quarters. He had a staff topped with a human skull he'd found and painted green. Most importantly, he had the ear of the bosses. But with power came danger. Not everyone was convinced. Clankbash, the mech boy, was the first real threat. The scarred orc had replaced so many of his own parts with machinery that he clanked when he walked. His remaining organic eye watched Snikgit with deep suspicion during a gathering of the bosses in a circle. The mech boy announced his distrust of the grot. He argued that machines had proper spirits. You could see them spark and hear them growl. But this grot just made stuff up. Snikgit's mind raced. A direct confrontation with a mech boy would end badly. He needed to be cleverer. He agreed with Clankbash, surprising everyone. He said that yes, machines did have spirits, and that's why Gork had told him Clankbash was extra special. The machine spirits talked to the mech boy like Gork talked to Snikgit. Clankbash's suspicion wavered. Snikgit continued, saying Gork predicted the mech boy would build something amazing. something that would make all the other mechs jealous. But only if he listened to what the machine spirits were trying to tell him. When Clankbash asked how to hear them better, Snikgit made a show of thinking hard. He declared that Gork said the mechboy needed to meditate with his favorite wrench and pour some of that special red cooling oil on his head. Within a week, Clankbash was spending hours meditating with oil dripping down his face, convinced he was on the verge of a mechanical breakthrough. He stopped questioning Snikgit's prophecies, too absorbed in his own mystical journey. But for every problem Snikgit solved, two more arose. His fellow grots looked at him with a mixture of awe and resentment. Some tried to curry favor, offering him the best scraps of food or information. Others plotted against him, jealous of his elevated position. Then there was Scabgob. Scabgob was unique among orcs. He could actually think. Not well and not often, but enough to be dangerous. He'd lost an arm in battle and replaced it with a power claw, which he liked to flex menacingly whenever Snikgit was around. One day, Scabgob announced he'd been thinking, which caused several nearby orcs to step back in alarm. An orc thinking was like a bomb ticking. He questioned how Snikgit's prophecies always came true. When the grot said much blood would be spilled, there was always blood. When he said to avoid the sun, it was always hot. It was like he was just saying stuff that would happen anyway. The gathering of orcs fell silent. This was dangerously close to logic, something that made them all uncomfortable. Snikgit knew he had to act fast. He praised Scabgob for questioning, saying Gork liked his followers to be smart. That's why the god had a special message for him. Tomorrow, Scabgob would face a big test. Something would challenge him, and if he passed, he'd get a sign of Gork's favor. Snikgit spent that night in frantic preparation. He snuck into the mech's workshop and made some adjustments to Scabgob's bike. Nothing major, just loosening a few bolts here and there. Then he spread rumors among the boys that Scabgob had been talking about challenging Scarface for leadership. The next day, events unfolded beautifully. Scabgob, paranoid about the test, decided to go for a ride to clear his head. His bike, compromised by Snikgit's sabotage, threw him into a scrap pile just as Scarface was walking by. The war boss, already suspicious from the rumors, interpreted this as an attack. The fight was brief and brutal. Scabgob, dazed from his crash, didn't stand a chance. As he lay bleeding in the mud, missing his other arm now, Snikgit approached. The Grot Prophet declared loudly that Gork was disappointed Scabgob had failed his test of faith. But the god was merciful. If he accepted Gork's wisdom, he would live. Scabgob, faced with death or conversion, chose survival. He proclaimed his belief that Gork talked to the grot. After that, open challenges to Snikgit's authority ceased. But the pressure was building inside the little grot. Every day brought new lies, new manipulations, new chances for his deception to be revealed. He started having nightmares where Gork and Mork actually appeared, angry at him for using their names in vain. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd gained more power than any grot in memory, but he was more terrified than ever. Every successful prediction raised expectations. Every ritual that worked meant they'd want bigger, better ones. He invented the doctrine of the 7 sacred scars, claiming that orcs with exactly 7 battle scars were blessed. This led to some orcs deliberately wounding themselves to reach the magic number, while others with 8 or more tried to figure out how to erase scars. He created the calendar of propitious violence, declaring certain days lucky for different types of warfare. Tuesdays were good for ambushes, Thursdays for frontal assaults, and Sundays were reserved for maintaining weapons, mainly because Snikgit wanted one day where he was less likely to die. The orcs ate it up. They loved having rules and rituals, even if they didn't understand them. It gave structure to their chaotic existence, purpose to their violence. But Snikgit's greatest challenge was yet to come. The Space Marines arrived on a Thursday, which according to Snikgit's calendar was perfect for frontal assaults. Unfortunately, the Imperial Fists had not consulted his schedule. They came in drop pods, slamming into the camp. Snikgit watched in horror from his tent as ceramic-armored giants tore through the orc defenses. Bolt of fire turned orcs into red mist. Chainswords carved through green flesh like butter. This wasn't a battle, it was extermination. Grimtooth burst into Snikgit's tent, covered in blood and missing an ear. The knob demanded to know where the prophecy was, why Gork hadn't warned them. Snikgit's mind went blank. He'd been so busy maintaining his daily deceptions that he'd missed the signs of an incoming attack. No amount of clever lies could explain this away. Or could they? The grot shrieked that Gork had warned them. He'd said Thursday was for frontal assaults. He was telling them the humans would attack them frontally on Thursday. They had misunderstood. Gork's wisdom was beyond them. They needed to perform the ultimate ritual immediately. Grimtooth asked what that was, and Snikgit made it up as he went. He ordered the knob to gather all the boys in the center of camp. Every orc, every weapon, every vehicle formed into a circle. As Grimtooth ran to spread the word, Snikgit's desperate plan took shape. He couldn't stop the Space Marines with fake prophecies, but maybe he could use orc psychology against them. The survivors gathered in the camp's center, forming a rough circle around a pile of burning debris. Snikgit climbed atop a wrecked truck, visible to all. He proclaimed that Gork and Mork were testing them, that they'd sent these beakies to see if the orcs were worthy. But he knew the secret to victory. Bolter fire echoed closer. The Space Marines were methodically clearing the camp, building by building. Snikgit declared they had to show the gods they weren't afraid. They had to charge all at once, from all directions. But first, they had to believe. Every orc who truly believed in Gork and Mork's power was to raise their weapon and warg. The response was deafening. Hundreds of orcs raised their weapons, bellowing their war cry. The sound echoed off the valley walls, primal and terrifying. Snikgit could see the Space Marines advancing through the smoke. Against hundreds of orcs in open ground, it would be a massacre. But if the orcs hit them all at once, from every angle, pumped up on religious fervor, he told them that when he dropped his staff, everyone was to charge at once. The gods would guide their bullets and strengthen their choppers, but only if they believed. He dropped the staff. The charge was like nothing Snikgit had ever seen. Orcs poured forward from every direction, screaming prayers to Gork and Mork, absolutely convinced their gods were watching. Some ran straight into bolter fire, but so many came that the Space Marines couldn't target them all. The battle devolved into a melee. Power armor was strong, but hundreds of choppers found weak points. Disciplined formations broke apart under the sheer weight of bodies. For every orc that fell, 3 more took his place, driven by fanatic belief. Snikgit didn't watch the end. He was already running, using the chaos to escape. Behind him, he could hear Scarface bellowing orders, Grimtooth's distinctive war cry, the desperate bark of bolters running low on ammunition. He made it to the edge of camp before guilt stopped him. These orcs were brutal, stupid, and had made his life miserable for decades. But they'd also believed in him. In their own violent way, they'd accepted him as more than just a grot. Cursing himself for a fool, Snikgit turned back. He couldn't fight, but maybe he could still help. He snuck around the battle's edge, looking for an opportunity. He found it in the form of the Space Marine sergeant, separated from his squad and reloading his bolter. The massive warrior didn't even notice the tiny grot until Snikgit jammed his staff into a gap in the Marine's knee armor. It shouldn't have worked. The staff was just wood and bone, the armor blessed ceramite. But whether by luck or the sheer irony of the universe, the staff found a weak point where a previous battle had left microscopic cracks. The sergeant stumbled. That stumble was enough. Scarface's power claw found the Marine's neck, ending him in a spray of blood. The warboss looked down at Snikgit with something almost like respect, commenting that Gork had guided the grot's stick. The battle turned after that. Leaderless, outnumbered, the remaining Space Marines performed a fighting withdrawal to their Thunderhawk. They left dozens of orc bodies in their wake, but they left. The camp erupted in celebration. They'd driven off the angels of death. Gork and Mork had blessed them, and it was all thanks to Snikgit's prophecy and ritual. But Snikgit felt no joy. Standing among the corpses, covered in blood and ash, he realized the trap he'd built for himself. The lie had grown too big. The orcs didn't just believe his prophecies now, they needed them. Their faith in his connection to the gods had become fundamental to their identity as a warband. That night, as the orcs celebrated with fungus, beer, and squig meat, Snikgit sat alone in his tent. He'd started this to avoid beatings and death. Now he was responsible for hundreds of lives. Every decision, every fake prophecy could lead to survival or massacre. A shadow fell across his entrance. Snikgit looked up to see something impossible, a weird boy, crackling with green energy, standing in his doorway. The weird boy introduced himself as Zogwart, just arrived from another clan. He'd heard about Snikgit, the grot who talked to Gork and Mork. The weird boy's eyes were unsettling, seeming to see things that weren't there. He stepped closer, green lightning playing around his staff, and Snikgit could feel the warg energy radiating from him like heat. Zogwart revealed a funny thing: he actually did hear the gods, had been hearing them since he was a youth, and lately they'd been laughing about some clever little grot who had everybody fooled. This was it, the end of everything. Snikgit closed his eyes, waiting for the killing blow. Instead he heard laughter. Rough, orky laughter. Zogwart slapped his knee, praising Snikgit for having balls for a grot. The gods had told him all about it, how the grot had been faking it the whole time. When Snikgit asked if the weird boy would tell everyone, Zogwart questioned why he would do that. The grot had done more for the clan's faith than any real prophet. They fought harder, worked together better, all because they thought Snikgit was blessed. That was proper orky cunning. The weird boy sat down, making himself comfortable. He explained that the gods didn't care about the lies. What Gork and Mork really wanted was for orcs to fight, to be strong, to be cunning. Snikgit had given them all that. In fact, the gods were so amused, they wanted to make him an offer. The offer was simple: keep doing what he was doing. Make the boys believe, make them strong. And sometimes, just sometimes, his prophecies might actually come true. The tent filled with green light, and Snikgit felt something vast and alien brush against his mind. Laughter, ancient and terrible, echoed in his skull. Then Zogwart was gone, leaving only the smell of ozone and a small green stone on the floor. Snikgit picked up the stone. It was warm to the touch, pulsing with inner light. As he held it, he felt different, not blessed exactly, but connected to something larger. The next morning he woke with a prophecy on his lips, not one he'd planned or schemed, but something that had come to him in dreams. A storm was coming from the east, bringing metal birds with fire in their bellies. 3 days. He told Grimtooth, who told Scarface, who ordered scouts eastward. They came back with reports of an Imperial Navy squadron heading their way. Exactly 3 days later, Valkyries filled the sky. But the orcs were ready. They dug in, prepared anti-aircraft guns, positioned themselves perfectly. The battle was still brutal, but it was a victory rather than a massacre. Snikgit watched from his usual safe distance, clutching the green stone. He hadn't known about the attack through spying or clever deduction. The knowledge had simply been there when he woke up. The other prophecies were still lies, mostly. He still performed ridiculous rituals and made up doctrines. But now, occasionally, truth mixed with fiction. Real visions came between the fabrications. The gods, it seemed, enjoyed the joke so much they decided to play along. Life in the warband took on a surreal quality. Snikgit never knew which of his pronouncements would prove divinely inspired and which were pure invention. The stress of it should have killed him, but somehow he thrived. Perhaps the touch of the gods protected him, or perhaps he'd simply adapted to insanity. He instituted the festival of Gork's Grin, where orcs competed to tell the funniest jokes while punching each other. He created an entire theology around the spiritual significance of different types of Daka. His fellow grots no longer envied him, they worshipped him. He'd achieved the impossible, rising from slave to prophet. Young grots would approach him for wisdom, which he dispensed with appropriate mysticism. He'd tell them that the gods made grots small so they could fit in the cracks of the universe, see things the big ones missed. But the greatest test of his new existence came when Warlord Garzkul himself visited the camp. Garzkul Mag Uruk Thraka was legend made flesh. The prophet of the Warg, chosen of Gork and Mork, the greatest orc alive. His presence made reality bend. When he walked into camp, even the air seemed to salute. Scarface, massive as he was, looked like a child next to Garzkul. The entire warband gathered, trembling with religious awe. And somehow, word reached the great warlord about their local prophet. Gaskell rumbled for them to bring him this grot. His voice was like tectonic plates grinding. Snikgit had faced death many times, but this was different. This was judgment from someone who genuinely spoke with the gods. His deception would be laid bare, and not even Zogwart's amusement could save him. He approached on shaking legs, his skull staff rattling. Gaskell's massive head turned down to regard him. The warlord identified him as Snikgit, the grot prophet, and commanded him to show his power. Snikgit's mind went blank. Show him what? A prophecy? A ritual? Before he could think, his mouth opened and words spilled out. But they weren't his words. The words spoke of a great green tide rising in the galactic west, of the human empire burning from within. They told of the time of the beast approaching, when the biggest warg ever seen would drown the stars in blood. They proclaimed Gaskell as the herald, but said even he was just the beginning. Gork and Mork were gathering their children for the final fight. The words came from somewhere else, through him rather than from him. Green fire danced in his vision. When it cleared, he found himself on his knees, the taste of copper in his mouth. Gaskell was smiling. It was terrifying. The warlord announced that the little one spoke truth. He could feel it in his bones. Gork and Mork worked through many voices, even tiny ones. He reached down and impossibly gently patted Snikgit on the head. He praised the little prophet's work, telling him to keep the boys believing, keep them strong. As Gaskell left, taking half the warband with him for his great crusade, Snikgit remained kneeling in the mud. He'd prophesied truly and spoken words of genuine power. But he hadn't meant to. It had just happened. That night, Zogwart visited again. The weird boy cackled about enjoying the show, how Gaskell had been properly impressed. He said Snikgit was becoming something interesting. Snikgit confessed his confusion. Was he a real prophet now or still a fake? Zogwart declared he was both, and that's what made it funny. The grot had started by pretending to hear the gods. Now sometimes he actually did, but he couldn't tell which was which. That was the best joke of all. The weird boy left, his laughter echoing in the night. Snikgit sat alone, contemplating his strange fate. He'd begun as a desperate grot trying to avoid death. Now he was something unprecedented, a false prophet who sometimes spoke truth, a charlatan blessed by the very gods he'd used for deception. The warband, reduced but not broken, looked to him for guidance more than ever. Young orcs who'd grown up with his prophecies believed absolutely. Older ones who might have been skeptical had seen too many predictions come true to doubt now. Snikgit adapted to his new reality. He learned to recognize the difference between his own clever lies and genuine divine inspiration. The latter came with headaches and the taste of metal. He balanced both, weaving truth and fiction into a theology that made the warband stronger. He created the Codex Orconomicus, a collection of divine laws that included such wisdom as always reloading during dramatic speeches and painting lucky teeth gold for extra luck. Half the rules were practical advice disguised as religious doctrine. The other half were pure nonsense that somehow worked through orky belief. Years passed. Snikgit grew old for a grot, his green skin weathering to leather, his cunning deepening to genuine wisdom. He trained successor prophets, teaching them the art of useful deception mixed with openness to real divine inspiration. He'd tell his students that the trick wasn't to lie all the time, but to lie so well that even the universe started believing you. His greatest triumph came during the War of the Bleeding Stars. The warband, now known as the Blessed of Gork's Grin, faced a Necron tomb world awakening. The ancient machines were antithetical to everything orcish. Cold, logical, utterly without superstition. Snikgit knew conventional orc tactics would fail, so he invented new ones. He proclaimed that the metal skeletons had no souls, which meant they couldn't see anything painted purple. Purple was the color of sneaky, and soulless things couldn't understand sneaky. It was absolute nonsense. But the orcs believed it so completely that their purple-painted commandos somehow became harder to detect. Whether through psychic warg energy or sheer cosmic irony, the Necron's senses struggled to lock onto the garish purple orcs. The battle was still horrific. Gauss weapons flayed orcs to atoms. Resurrection protocols brought fallen Necrons back again and again. But the purple commandos reached the tomb's power sources, planting explosives with gleeful abandon. As the tomb world burned, he was no longer the terrified grot who'd lied about a vision. He was something unique in the galaxy, a prophet who'd made his own prophecies true through sheer audacity. But the universe had one more test for him. The Chaos warband came from the warp storm that had been growing on the sector's edge. Word-bearers, ancient and terrible, seeking to corrupt the Orc-Warg energy for their dark gods. They brought demons and sorcery, weapons that attacked the soul as much as the body. Snikgit felt their presence like acid on his mind. The green stone Zogwart had given him grew hot, pulsing with warning. These weren't enemies you could trick with purple paint or burning tires. They dealt in truths that could drive mortals mad. The first attack came at night. Demons flowed through the camp, and several orcs simply fell dead from terror. Others turned on their brothers, possessed by warp entities. For the first time in decades, the warband's faith wavered. Scarface found Snikgit in his tent, the old warboss showing fear for perhaps the first time in his life. The warboss pleaded for guidance. His chopper passed right through the demons. Daka didn't work. Even Clankbash's best guns just made them laugh. Snikgit closed his eyes, reaching for inspiration. What came wasn't from Gork or Mork. It was from somewhere deeper, the accumulated cunning of every grot who'd ever survived through wit rather than strength. He ordered every orc in camp to be gathered, along with all the paint, every last drop. When Scarface questioned whether they were going to paint themselves, Snikgit grinned madly. No, they were going to paint the demons. The plan was insane even by orc standards. As the demons attacked again, the orcs didn't fight back conventionally. Instead, they threw paint. Buckets and buckets of bright orky paint. Green and yellow, red and blue, purple and orange. Every demon that materialized was immediately doused in color. A bloodletter roared in confusion as Grimtooth emptied a can of hot pink over its head. The demon demanded to know what the orcs were doing, calling their paint attack pathetic and claiming they couldn't harm demons with mere paint. Snikgit shouted from atop his command truck that they weren't trying to harm the demons, they were making them orky. The demons paused, confused. That moment of uncertainty was all the Warg field needed. Orc belief, powerful enough to make red vehicles go faster, focused on a single thought. Anything covered in orc paint became orky, and orky things could be crumped. The first chopper to connect with a painted demon drew blood. Red, orky blood. The warband erupted in delighted violence. Demons found themselves suddenly solid, suddenly vulnerable, suddenly very concerned about the hundreds of orcs bearing down on them with renewed enthusiasm. The Chaos Lord screamed about impossibility, insisting the warp's power was absolute. Snikgit retorted that Gork and Mork's power was absolutia. He declared the Chaos Lord was just another git who needed crumping. The word-bearers retreated in disorder, their beautiful corruption ritual ruined by the sheer ridiculousness of paint-based theology. As they fled, Snikgit heard something in the warp, distant laughter, not just from Gork and Mork, but from other powers amused by the upset. In the aftermath, as orcs cheerfully looted demon weapons that had been orcified by paint, Zogwart appeared one last time. The weird boy announced that Snikgit had done it. For once, he seemed serious. The grot had created something new, not just fake prophecy, not just real prophecy, but prophecy that made itself true through pure belief. The gods didn't know whether to be impressed or terrified. When Snikgit asked what happened now, Zogwart explained that now the grot was part of the story forever. Every orc who told tales of great prophets would speak of Snikgit, the grot who lied so good he made the universe believe him. But more importantly, he'd shown every grot that they didn't have to stay at the bottom. Sometimes, being small and clever beat being big and strong. As the weird boy faded into green mist, Snikgit realized he was crying. Not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of pride, exhaustion, and the absurdity of it all. He'd started as a desperate grot carrying squig droppings. Now he was a legend, a prophet whose lies had become truth, whose cowardice had become cunning, whose survival had become inspiration. The warband would spread his story across the galaxy, and somewhere when another clever grot would hear it and think of possibilities. That night, Snikgit climbed to the highest point in camp, the skull-decorated spire of his prophet's tower. Below him, orcs celebrated their victory with typical enthusiasm. Fires burned, weapons fired into the air, and the sacred burning tire ritual was performed by dozens of eager believers. He looked up at the stars, where somewhere Gork and Mork watched and laughed. He'd fooled everyone, including himself. He'd become what he'd pretended to be, the fake prophet who'd made faith real. The grot muttered to himself that it wasn't bad for a grot, allowing himself a moment of pride. Then a young grot approached, trembling with awe. The youngling claimed to have had a vision of purple humans attacking from the south. Snikgit studied the young grot carefully. There was something in his eyes, that familiar mixture of terror and cunning. Another desperate soul trying to escape the bottom of the heap through clever lies. Snikgit told him kindly to share his vision, reminding him that the best lies had a little truth in them. The young grot's eyes widened with understanding. The cycle continued. As dawn broke over the ramshackle camp, painting the scrap metal gold and the bloodstains black, Snikgit descended from his tower. He had rituals to invent, prophecies to proclaim, and a warband to guide through the insane galaxy they inhabited. He was Snikgit the Prophet, the grot who'd lied to the gods and made them laugh. His story would be told wherever orcs gathered, a testament to the power of cunning over strength, belief over reality, and the fundamental orky truth that if enough orcs believed something, it became real. The warband marched out that morning, following his prophecy about purple humans to the south. Whether the prophecy was true or not didn't matter anymore. They'd make it true through sheer bloody-minded belief. And somewhere in the warp, Gork and Mork continued laughing at the best joke in the galaxy, a grot so cunning he'd tricked himself into greatness. Snikgit adjusted his skull staff, checked that his green stone was secure, and prepared to tell his next great lie. Or truth. He honestly couldn't tell the difference anymore. And that, perhaps, was the greatest prophecy of all.